of Collected Works. And Dorothy, do you have an announcement you want to make today? Or?
I just want to say welcome. Thank you for filling this space with ideas, with people, with enthusiasm. That is what this space is all about. My highest regards to Melissa Williams, who makes this extraordinary series happen every Sunday morning here. We're proud to be hosting it. And Brian Egolf, welcome back. It's always a treat to hear you and what's on your mind. Thank you for coming.
Hey, where's my granddaughter? Bella, give me a couple of cheers too, will you? So I too want to thank Melissa Williams for sponsoring this. Oh, she's getting all embarrassed. But give Melissa Williams a hand for 5.5 years of this presentation. I also want to introduce the Associate Executive Director of Unicopia, who's here today, Maxine Suissa. Say hi. And I just want to kind of give you a little bit of a brief overview of Unicopia. It is a nonprofit that is dedicated to the awareness, knowledge, and synergy that is key to our sustainable future. And to that end, Maxine and I went about building the Emerald Home, which is sort of an icon here in Santa Fe. And it is the center for our nonprofit, and we do ongoing tours on green building sustainability and energy efficiency, which it is sort of renowned for. Kind of missed the word there. And because it makes more energy than it uses, so it's a national model. We train building officials and experts and inspectors, plan reviewers, educators, students, builders, architects, goes on and on. So maybe check out our website, because we announce tours from time to time, and if any of you want to participate in coming through the Emerald Home, we'd like to see you there. Also, I just want to mention, before I introduce Brian, the basket is going around, and the suggested donation is whatever you can free up today to help the cause here, so do your best. And I just want to mention sustainable thought, and that's something I like to talk about every week on the radio and most days, and that is being grateful, being appreciative, being in the day, looking around and seeing all the many blessings that we have, especially living here in this beautiful place, Santa Fe. And from there, we can generate the future that we want to create by staying positive and being a part of the solution by flowing the energy correctly for ourselves in our individual lives. And the unity consciousness, and that's where the piece Unicopia comes from, the unity consciousness, or the working together towards the prosperity that we want to create, both individually and collectively. So now I'm going to take a moment to introduce our very special guest. And Brian is just an awesome champion of the environment and causes for the people, sustainability in general, and a good friend of mine. He's been just an amazing player here in our community, and I'm just proud as can be to introduce Brian Egolf.
Thanks, Faren. Melissa, thank you for having me. I have to apologize. In New Mexico, legislators, we have no staff or anybody, and it was harder than it should have been for us to get connected on email. So thanks for putting up with that and for having me here. And Dorothy, is she still here? She's around. She said thanks for filling the space with ideas. But guys, this is a bookstore, so before you leave, fill the cash register with some money and buy some books, please, before you leave. You know, we all talk about the local economy and the importance of keeping things local and how nice it is to have a local bookstore like this, but if you don't actually buy a couple books before you leave, then this place can't be here, and it wouldn't be very fun to meet at the shell of a Borders or something like that. So help out Dorothy for helping us. I thought what I'd do today is give you a little snapshot of where we are politically. We got the election is 3 weeks from Tuesday. There's a lot going on locally. And we all follow nationally, but I think there's a lot of things that are changing locally. I thought I'd give you a quick snapshot of where we are in terms of the upcoming elections and what I see happening in the next session. Talk a little bit. I had a question about the amendments. I've had some folks ask me about water today. I thought I'd touch on those two topics, and then go into questions. Unless folks want to hear me talk and talk and talk, I like to do a little opener and then hear from you, so that I'm sure to be addressing topics that you think are interesting. So if that works for everybody, I'll talk for a little bit and then we'll go into questions. I'm in the State House, and the district that I represent has changed. It now includes downtown Santa Fe. It goes from the Opera to Cerrillos and Madrid down south, and then over to Glorieta, with the basically south of the Santa Fe River, between the river and I-25, has been taken out, and that's other folks. So kind of go around and up. So now I'm actually in my district, Dorothy, which is cool. For a long time, almost forever, with the exception of 2 years since statehood, the state legislature has been controlled by Democrats. There was, when Dwight Eisenhower came in as president in 1952, there were fewer seats then. There were, I think it was 56. There's 70 now, but there were 56 then. And the Democrats had something like a 35-seat majority, and when Eisenhower came in, they lost 40 seats or something amazing like that, and there was a 2-seat Republican majority for 2 years, and then there was a huge tidal shift right back to the Democrats 2 years later, 35 seats. So basically, other than that one little snippet, the Democrats have had a majority in the State House. And everyone has kind of taken that for granted, I think especially in Santa Fe. This is predominantly, if not necessarily Democratic, it's certainly predominantly a progressive community, and we like to see, I think, those values reflected in what's happening in the state legislature. This year, everything is completely different. And when I first was elected 4 years ago, we had 45 Democrats and 25 Republicans. We had a big, big majority. 2010 happened, and we lost 8 seats, and then we lost another member who left the party, and so we had 36-34. Redistricting occurs. That's when they have to redraw all the boundaries, and what happens then is a lot of the gains that the other party made have been sort of solidified in the way that districts are now drawn, and then the district judge, Judge Hall from here in Santa Fe, took a seat away from the Democrats and gave it to the Republicans. So the Democrats in the House are now at 35 out of 70, so we have exactly half. So what that means is, as we all run for re-election, if all the democratically held seats right now get re-elected, we'll have a tie. And knowing us Democrats, it's very likely that one, at least, would leave the party and vote with the Republicans to elect a speaker, and so we'd have a Republican speaker. So if we're going to continue to have a democratically controlled House of Representatives, at least one, but preferably 2 or 3, in my view, Republicans running for re-election need to be defeated so that we can have a Democratic speaker again for the next 2 years. Current speaker's not running for re-election. He's quite ill, and so we'll have a new speaker regardless of which party comes in. So it's very different than it's been for all of my life and all of your lives, and this is a campaign that really is going to have a big impact. Now, why does it matter who controls the state legislature? Well, you can look at Ohio and Wisconsin, look at Michigan, look at Texas. It's been a little longer in Texas, but look there too, and you can see that especially recently, when legislatures changed in 2010, something like 700 legislators lost re-election in 2010, and 17 chambers switched control, and 12 states switched entirely from Democrat to Republican. So we have some experience about what happens when control shifts. You don't get a slightly more conservative version of the plan that the Democrats are working on. You get pretty radically different things. So there's a reason that everybody now knows a lot of specifics that we never really knew before about all different kinds of ultrasounds that are performed on women before they have an abortion, for example. You know, these terms now are part of the political discourse in a way that 2 years ago I didn't even know what the terms were. That's thanks to Virginia, which actually passed and signed a law to require these things. You look all across the board, and instead of seeing more conservative approaches on how to do job creation or how to balance the budget, you see the social legislation, you see bills that come in to target workers' rights, you see the bills come in that talk about defining marriage, you see incredible restrictions on women's health care decisions, and on and on and on. That's what would be in store for us here. Now, in New Mexico, if we lose control of the legislature. a lot of the things that people care about in their day-to-day lives, and I didn't really appreciate this until I was elected to the legislature, but a lot of what we see day-to-day is coming from the state government. It's often federal dollars that run programs, but they're channeled through the state government, and so state policy makes a big, big difference. So everyone here that cares about policy really should care about what's happening coming up. We have races going from Chaparral, which is this huge unincorporated community, and right outside of Las Cruces. It is actually a little bit larger than El Dorado. So El Dorado, which I've represented for the first 4 years, actually is not the largest unincorporated community in the state. It's Chaparral, where they have about 20,000 people that live there. There's no mayor. They rely on the county commission there to give them scraps. Lots of immigrants that live there, high Spanish-speaking population. Everyone there gets their water from drinking water wells, and everyone there is on a septic system. And one of the most amazing days of mine in the legislature was when we go down there, and the kids in the schools that they have, we had to move one and do a lot of work because they were getting these aguas negras. They were getting sewage bubbling up in the playgrounds of the kindergarten there. And that was sort of typical. And so we've done a lot of work to try and remedy those problems. So we've got races that come from Chaparral outside of Las Cruces all the way up to Farmington. There's about 12 districts that are swing seats now. And if folks are interested, you can ask questions later. I can tell you what's happening where and in which communities. But there's one that's local, District 43, is represented by a man named Jim Hall. He was appointed by the governor to the legislature, to the state house when Jeanette Wallace passed away in office. And part of that district comes down into Santa Fe, La Cienega, and part along 599 and the bypass. And that's a pretty hotly contested race between him and his challenger, Stephanie Garcia Richard, as a Democrat. She almost won last time, and she's coming back. That's really the only swing seat election that we have here in Santa Fe. Other than that, you're stuck with us. So I don't have an opponent. Peter Worth doesn't have an opponent. Most of us that are on the ballot here in Santa Fe, you're going to have us like us or not. So all the action, except for Stephanie, is in Albuquerque and points south. Over the last 2 years, we saw a big change in the legislature. When I was serving under Governor Richardson, we were doing a lot of work on renewable energy initiatives. We were doing a lot of work on film and expanding that industry in New Mexico. Water was a big priority. We're doing clean water projects throughout the state, especially in the southern part where the situations, as I just described, is pretty serious. And we were dealing with a big budget deficit each year under the last 2 years of the Richardson administration, which we fixed and passed on to the governor. In spite of her speech at the national convention, she received a budget that was in surplus. But then the focus shifted, and so we've mostly gone on in the legislature a lot of defense. There's a reason, I think, that when you look at the governor of New Mexico as compared to others in the country, she is right now, not only is she the most popular Republican governor in the country, she's the most popular governor in the country, period. Her approval rating is about 69%. And she has the Democrats in the legislature to thank for that, because a lot of the things that she's pushed that I think would be unpopular haven't made it through. And so I have ideas, a couple of suggestions on that. A lot of the really divisive union laws that we've seen in Ohio and in Wisconsin were proposed here but were defeated. I think if those had been enacted, you might see the governor's numbers change a little bit. Enacting some of her education reforms, they sound good, but I think if they'd been enacted, would be unpopular. I can give you one example. This bill about social promotion, everyone's probably heard of this, right? Read in the newspaper, the governor is trying to put a bill in that says if you don't pass a reading test with the sufficient score by the end of the 3rd grade, then the child is held back. And that's an absolute requirement. Sounds good, right? It sounds like, well, we got to make sure the kids are reading by the end of the 3rd grade, because if they don't, the studies show all the negative consequences that flow from that. The other side, though, shows that children that are held back in the 3rd grade suffer lifelong consequences that are not good, in terms of they're then labeled for the rest of their time at the school as the dumb one, or the one that couldn't make it. And so there's a lot of things that flow from that. We had a big fight over this bill, and it really came down to one word. It was like sort of like, I felt like Bill Clinton in this committee. They said, it depends on what the definition of is. We were fighting over a word. It was either may or shall, and the whole idea was the governor's proposal on this education reform really ends up stripping parents of the ability to make a decision on how to educate their children. That's the bottom line. And the way it was set up was, we have a horrible problem in New Mexico with education, and we have a horrible problem in New Mexico with literacy. And the idea was that the bill was set up so that we would shift a lot of resources into earlier education, early reading programs, and then create the ability for parents and teachers to get in with the children and design programs to bolster their reading scores before they got to the end of the 3rd grade. These are education plans that are put in place. And the idea was that if the parents and the children attended 95% of the meetings and the courses, and there's a lot, it's every other week, so if they attend 95% of these meetings, and if the children are making improvement on the qualitative portion of the test, so does it seem like they're having greater reading comprehension? For example, if they meet 95% of the criteria, then what we wanted, the Democrats, what I wanted was that the parent could go to their principal and say, we've met all these criteria that we set out at the beginning of the year, and we think that our child is doing well enough to be promoted and then continue to catch up a little bit next year, and so we would like that child to be promoted to the 4th grade. In other words, if you meet all these check marks in a rigorous program, then you are sure that your child will be promoted to the 4th grade. The governor wanted it the opposite, was that if you met all these check marks, then you would go to the principal, and the principal would have the discretion to hold the child back. That was the only difference in what we were fighting over, but I thought it was worth making sure that once you had engaged parents that really showed up and met all the requirements, that they should be able to decide, yeah, I want my child, after all, it's my child, it's not the principal's, I want my child to be able to go forward because that's what I think is best. Now that's a very kind of detailed description of what was going on. It doesn't make for a great soundbite, but that kind of gives a sense of the fights that we're having. We're not getting a lot of compromise right now in the legislature. We've had bipartisan compromises worked out on the issue of immigrant driver's licenses. We just had one in the last 30-day session. And as soon as the word got out that there was a bipartisan compromise in one of the committees, the governor's chief of staff showed up and literally pulled 2 people out of the committee room and reminded them that they probably didn't want to have vigorous primary challenges in the Republican primaries in June, and their votes switched and the bipartisan compromise went away. That happens over and over again. And what I think coming up in this election, the reason that the stakes are high is not only because of the policies that would or would not be implemented, but also the governor is putting huge political capital and huge resources into switching control of the legislature, and she's really targeted a couple senators and a couple members of the House for defeat. If she fails in that endeavor, which I hope she will, if she fails, my hope, and my wife Kelly is here, she's looking at me kind of like, I need to stop being quite so optimistic, but I hope that if she's defeated in these legislative races, that she will get a little more on board with the whole compromise concept and start working, because, and I've told her this numerous times, she's our governor. I love New Mexico. I want her to be a successful governor, and I really mean that. I want her to make the state better for everybody. And in order to get there, you've got to have some compromise along the way, because I'm not right 100% of the time. She's not right 100% of the time either. And there's some good cross-pollination that can happen when people really do sit down and try and sort these things out. So that's another reason I think the stakes are high, because if we hold on, then I think we could try and get her to compromise a little bit more, because she'll realize that this repeated attempt to get things passed that aren't passing won't work, and so we need to work out some other alternative. There are some folks before we started asked me about constitutional amendments. There's 5 on the ballot. We don't have straight, and I'll mention before I say that, we don't have straight ticket voting anymore in New Mexico, so it's really important to go through the whole ballot, please. The race for the State Court of Appeals is a big one. We've got a Santa Fe lawyer who's an Albuquerque judge, but she's from here, Monica Zamora, is running for the Court of Appeals. Don't forget that one. That's a biggie. The State Supreme Court, we've got Barbara V. Hill, who is an amazing person. I mean, if you were to sit down and if you had to take a case, especially a family law case, something that was important to you, and if you were to just dream up the perfect judge to hear your case and make sure that things were going to be done right, it's Barbara V. Hill. She's our candidate for State Supreme Court. Please keep her in mind. She is fantastic. But you don't get to vote for her unless you go all the way through the ballot, so keep that in mind. There's a number of judges. There's one Republican, 2 Democrats that are judges. I think you should retain them all, even the Republican, who's quite good. And so the judges deserve to be retained, but you got to go through and vote yes on retention. There's an interesting thing about retention. In New Mexico, the way we get judges, people apply to a commission, and then the names are sent up to the governor to choose from 3 or so names. And then they run in a partisan election, Democrat versus Republican. After that, they stand for retention, and in order to be retained, they need 57.5%. So 50%, like for me, if I have an opponent, 50% works. For a judge, you need 57.5%. So it's important to go through and actually try and retain these folks because they do a really good job. We've got 5 constitutional amendments. The first one adds 2 members to the Judicial Standards Commission. I don't think it's a big deal either way, but getting some additional perspective, especially the citizen member on the board, can't hurt. There was an editorial from the paper saying that it's adding bureaucracy and cost. It would add about $500 a year because these folks only get paid per diem and they meet fewer than 5 times a year. So it's good to probably get a little more perspective in that. The 3 PRC amendments are all absolute yeses. I don't need to tell people that the PRC has had a lot of problems. And this is a first step. We had other proposals, one of which was mine, so I really was partial to it, but it didn't pass, that would have made the PRC no longer an elected body, would have been appointed like we do with judges. That didn't make it, but in the meantime, these are, I think, good ideas to establish minimum qualifications to get the state superintendent of insurance out and independent on his or her own. And
can I ask a question about that? I mean, you say that, but they're very loosely defined. And
right.
If the Republicans take control of the legislature, because of the loose definition in the amendments, aren't we really running a real risk, for instance, that somehow the governor has control of the superintendent of insurance? That's a real possibility.
Right. But we're not going to have this governor forever. And your point is well taken about the circumstances as they exist right now.
Yeah.
But sometimes I feel like you've got to do the right overall policy move and then hope it works, because this is our chance to do it right now. The next step is to make the superintendent of insurance elected. Okay, so that would be step 2, and that's what we're going to work on in the next session. They do that in a lot of different states, and it works pretty well. Yeah, so you'll kind of get it out and then make it independently elected. That's going to be a big deal under the Affordable Care Act when the state superintendent of insurance has a lot of discretion. But in terms of differences right now, the superintendent of insurance being beholden to the current membership of the PRC or to the governor, it's at worst a wash, and at best we have more direct influence over the governor's choice, at least through a confirmation of the superintendent of insurance. Right now it's just he's hired and that's it, and the legislature has nothing. So we're very likely to maintain control of the state senate, and so we'll at least get some vetting of the superintendent of insurance through that. But it all has to also be done through legislation. So obviously we have a difference.
I like your appointed idea better. Yeah.
So we do the best we can, and then the third takes various functions of the PRC and redistributes them out among other parts of state government, so that the PRC really can get more focused in on what they're supposed to be doing, which is utility regulation. Try and help them get more focused on that. The 5th one, no one is talking about this very much, but it is, I think, the most important one there is on the ballot. Number 5, that takes the public defender. We have a statewide public defender in New Mexico. It takes the public defender out from under the governor and makes that an independent person who's chosen by a nominating commission. Right now, the governor, and this is especially important when we have a governor who's a prosecutor, okay? The governor in New Mexico oversees the public defender and the executive branch through the DAs are the prosecute the cases. So we got the same branch of government that is So you got the governor who's picking the public defender for the state. She's a prosecutor. Governor controls the budget for the public defender, and they get maybe a third of the funding of the prosecutors. Not only is that bad because it's not fair in terms of lopsidedness of funding, but prosecutors get to determine the size of their docket. In other words, they can decide whether or not to prosecute a case. Public defenders don't. They get someone who's been charged, and they have to accept them and defend them. So they don't control the size of their workload like prosecutors do. And it is hugely unpopular politically to fight in the legislature for money for the public defender so that they can put criminals back out on the street, right? I mean, that's how it's portrayed, right? If, people that go in there and say, I want the public defender to be strong, it's like Egolf wants to throw these guys out on the street, and I mean, well, that's not what it is, but that's how it's portrayed. And so by getting them independent, you have a much better chance that they can get the resources that they need to do the job that's so important to having a functioning judicial system and a functioning democracy, and protecting our constitutional rights. The reason we do these constitutional amendments, and this was the question, this is a great question, why do we have so many constitutional amendments that could probably be done by passing bills and having them signed into law by the governor? Right now the answer is because of our governor. In New Mexico, to get a constitutional amendment passed, it has to go through the legislature, and then it goes to the voters. And the governor's not involved in the process. So if you want something to become law, and the governor would veto it, but there's support in the legislature, one of the ways to do that is to pass a constitutional amendment. Probably not the best idea to put all these amendments onto our Constitution, but right now that's the only, if we think in the legislature things are important, the only way to get those done without having them vetoed by the governor is a constitutional amendment. So that's why we have so many right now, and as long as Martinez is governor, we'll probably see more of those coming down. We can have another debate, I guess, about whether it's good policy to be amending so much, but in the meantime, that's where we are. So I think, and water. So we have a state climatologist down in Las Cruces at New Mexico State, and he works in the School of Agriculture down there, and we had a presentation showing that not only are we on a series of the hottest, every month you advance and it becomes the hottest 12-month period in history for New Mexico. We also, and you can say the same thing for decades and centuries. It appears, and one of the interesting things they do is look at core samples from bristlecone pines and other very, very, very old trees, like they're 2,000 years old. And you can see, relatively speaking, how much precipitation is coming year to year or decade to decade. And we've just come through what is historically a very wet century. And so it appears that actually we're not really in a drought right now. We're in a normal. And we were in a wet period for the last 100 years or so. There's a book that you could buy from Dorothy Massey for $19.99 called Collapse, written by Jared Diamond. If anybody hasn't read it, I really commend it to you. It's a fascinating book about, the subtitle is called Choices Societies Make to Succeed or Fail. There's a great chapter in there, it's controversial. There's a great chapter in there about the Anasazi and how they expanded and grew during a historically wet period, and then what happened when they went back to the normal levels of precipitation. We have a lot more tools at our disposal to deal with the coming normal in terms of precipitation, but we need to be aware of what's happening. Some of the things that we're doing right now in New Mexico, about 85% of our water consumption is in agricultural uses. Only about 5% is in home use. Okay, so if you cut in half the amount of water everybody uses in their house all over the state of New Mexico, it would be a tiny amount towards the whole. But small savings in agricultural uses makes for a big savings overall. And so we're starting to see studies done at New Mexico State that are great about chili crops. How do you get water on the crops at precisely the right time so that you can save water but have the same production, or sometimes it's even more production than you otherwise would have. Laser leveling more fields, lined ditches, all sorts of things that are trying to update the traditional means of irrigation so that we're no longer state-of-the-art circa 1540 and try and be state-of-the-art circa 1900 even. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to do to improve efficiency, because a 10% savings, 10% is huge, but a 10% savings in agricultural efficiency is a monumental difference in terms of the amount of water that's available, not just for us to drink and for the businesses to use, but for habitat maintenance, in-stream flow. Now, we did do a bill, and we're coming back with another one this next session, to recognize the rights of people to put their agricultural water rights into in-stream flow without giving them over to the state. So right now you can give up water rights, and the state will own them, and they can be used for habitat maintenance along streams or recreational uses. We want to be able to have farmers decide that they want to retire a portion of their water rights for a certain amount of time, leave the water in the stream without them having to risk forfeiture of those rights. And you could also do for conservation easements for land. I don't know if folks know how this works, but if you've got a 100-acre farm somewhere and you want to take it out of farming production and turn it into wetlands or some sort of bird habitat, you can take it out and put it under a conservation easement, and you get a refundable tax credit from the state. It's been a hugely successful program passed by Peter Worth. I did an expansion of it 3 years ago to allow federal monies to come in to do big-time habitat restoration for places that are put under conservation easements. And we can do the same thing with water, so that if you take water rights and leave them in the stream flow, you could look at a tax credit possibility to incentivize people leaving the water in the stream, which is a big deal when you have to deal with federal mandates like on the silvery minnow and other things. For the first time ever this year, the silvery minnow situation was such that farmers up in Abiquiu were curtailed to leave rights and water in the stream so that there could be deliveries in the middle Rio Grande for critical habitat maintenance. That was not very popular in Abiquiu and points north. So there are ways that we can avoid having to do that, and this is one of the possibilities is with the state tax credit to allow the maintenance of in-stream flow. Because we do have a very, very serious problem, in your photos show that. Okay, so I think I've talked long enough, and would love to hear some questions.